At my nephew's birthday party, my sister smirked and said, "Maybe you should take the hint. You weren't invited." So I did. I canceled the money I'd been secretly giving the family, locked them out of the lake house, and when my cousin later applied for a job at my company, I sent her a rejection with 6 words. Maybe take the hint next time. My name is Caleb Anderson. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I have been the dependable one in my family. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I work as an IT consultant, which probably explains a lot about me. I'm quiet, organized, and the kind of person who notices details other people don't. I'm the one who remembers passwords, appointment times, birthdays, and the exact moment when something small begins to feel slightly wrong. For a long time, I ignored that feeling when it came to my own family. Growing up, I always believed families were supposed to work like teams. Everyone shows up, everyone supports each other, and if someone forgets something important, another person picks up the slack. I took that idea very seriously, even as an adult. Every birthday in our family calendar is saved on my phone with a reminder 2 days in advance. I send messages, I buy gifts, and sometimes I drive across the city just to drop something off in person. I'm usually the first person to arrive at family gatherings because I like helping set things up. I carry folding chairs from the garage, set plates on the table, and make sure there are enough drinks in the cooler. At the end of the night, I'm usually the last one still standing in the kitchen, rinsing dishes while everyone else says their goodbyes in the living room. For years, I believed that this was simply my role. Every family has someone like that, the reliable one who keeps things running smoothly. I never really expected praise or attention. Just being included felt like enough. At some point, though, something subtle began to change. It wasn't dramatic, and there wasn't a specific moment where everything suddenly shifted. It was more like a series of tiny details that slowly started to add up. The first thing I noticed was the group chats. One evening, my sister casually mentioned something funny that had been shared in the family chat earlier that day. Everyone at the dinner table laughed immediately, like they all understood the reference. I sat there, smiling politely, waiting for the moment when someone would explain the joke, but it never came. Eventually, I asked what they were talking about, and my brother looked at me with mild confusion and said it was posted in the group chat that morning. I remember nodding and pulling out my phone, assuming maybe I had muted the conversation or missed a notification. There was no group chat. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe they had created a temporary thread for planning something and forgot to add me. It didn't seem like a big deal. These things happen. Families get busy and people forget small details. I brushed it off and didn't mention it again. But over time, the same thing kept happening. My mom would reference a conversation everyone apparently had earlier in the week. My sister would bring up a photo someone shared that I had never seen. My brother would laugh about a meme that had been going around the chat. Each time I realized I had no idea what they were talking about. I told myself the same explanation every time. They probably forgot to add me. It wasn't intentional. Then there were the inside jokes. Those started appearing more often, too. During family dinners, someone would say a single phrase, and suddenly everyone would burst out laughing. I would smile and wait, assuming someone would fill me in, but usually the moment would pass and the conversation would move on without explanation. I told myself maybe I had simply missed the original moment that started the joke. Not every story needs to be retold. The strangest part, though, was the photos. Like most families, mine post pictures from gatherings online. Birthdays, barbecues, holidays, random Sunday dinners. I started noticing something odd when I would see those photos later. Everyone was there in the picture, standing together, smiling toward the camera. My parents, my siblings, sometimes cousins or family friends. But somehow I wasn't in any of them. The first time I saw one of those posts, I assumed I had simply stepped away when the photo was taken. Maybe I was grabbing a drink or helping in the kitchen. That seemed reasonable. But then it happened again and again. One picture in particular stuck with me. It was from a 4th of July barbecue at my parents' house. I clearly remember standing in the backyard while my aunt held up her phone to take a group picture. I had been leaning against the fence just a few feet away from everyone else. When I saw the photo online later that evening, everyone was arranged neatly in the frame, laughing and smiling under the string lights. I wasn't there. What made it strange was that I remembered standing just outside the frame, almost like someone had gently guided the camera away from where I was standing. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. When someone takes a group picture, people shift around, someone moves left or right, and sometimes one person ends up slightly out of view. It happens. Still, it kept happening. For years, I convinced myself that none of it meant anything. Families get messy, people forget things, and life moves quickly. I told myself that if I kept showing up, eventually things would settle back into place. I kept bringing gifts, kept arriving early to help set up chairs, and kept staying late to wash dishes after everyone else had gone home. Every time I walked into a family gathering, I carried the quiet hope that this time things would feel normal again, that someone would say my name when they were telling a story, that someone would remember to tag me in a photo, or that my phone would finally light up with a notification from the family group chat I had somehow never been added to. So I kept showing up, smiling, helping, and telling myself that sooner or later they would remember that I was supposed to be part of it too. A few weeks later, I drove down to Dayton for my nephew Ethan's 8th birthday party at my sister Melissa's house. It was about an hour and a half from Columbus, and I left earlier than I needed to, mostly out of habit. I've always preferred arriving early rather than rushing in at the last minute. The gift I brought sat carefully in the passenger seat the entire drive, a large box containing the robotics kit Ethan had been talking about for months. He had mentioned it during a phone call once, explaining how it could be programmed to follow commands and complete little tasks, and the excitement in his voice had stuck with me. I ordered the exact one he described, even though it was more expensive than I usually spend on gifts, because seeing that kind of excitement from him felt worth it. When I pulled into Melissa's driveway, the house was already full of noise. Balloons were tied to the mailbox, and a handful of kids were running around the front yard, holding slices of pizza and plastic cups of soda. Inside the house, the living room was crowded with parents standing in small groups while their kids moved in loud circles through the hallway and kitchen. Melissa greeted me quickly with a distracted smile and thanked me for coming, already turning to answer another parent who had a question about where the extra plates were. Ethan spotted the box in my hands almost immediately. His eyes lit up the second he recognized what it was, and he rushed over with the kind of pure excitement that only kids seem capable of showing without hesitation. He practically tore the wrapping paper open right there in the living room. And when the robotics kit appeared, he looked at me like I had just handed him something magical. For the next hour, we sat together at the dining table, surrounded by plastic packaging and instruction manuals, while the rest of the party continued around us. I helped him snap the first pieces together, showing him how the tiny motors connected to the frame and how the control module fit into place. Every time something clicked into position, he reacted like we had just accomplished something huge. For that hour of the afternoon actually felt good in a way that was hard to explain. Ethan was focused, curious, and completely absorbed in the process, asking questions about how the programming would work once everything was assembled. I walked him through the basics, explaining how the sensors could respond to simple commands and how eventually he could control the robot from a small app. Watching him lean over the table with that intense concentration made the long drive feel completely worth it. Eventually, the other kids started leaving with their parents, and the noise in the house slowly faded into something calmer. Wrapping paper covered the floor, empty soda cans sat on the kitchen counter, and a few balloons drifted lazily near the ceiling. Ethan ran upstairs with the robot parts to show his room to a friend who was staying the night, leaving the adults downstairs to deal with the mess left behind by a dozen excited children. Cleaning up after family events had always been something I naturally fell into doing without really thinking about it. I gathered paper plates, stacked cups, and started loading the dishwasher while Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. The quiet that follows a busy party is always a strange moment, when the energy disappears and the house suddenly feels larger than it did an hour earlier. For a few minutes, it actually felt almost normal between us. Melissa mentioned that Ethan was going to spend the next week obsessing over that robotics kit, and she thanked me again for getting it for him. I told her it was nothing and kept wiping down the counter while she continued scrolling through photos from the party that guests had already started posting. The moment felt relaxed enough that I casually mentioned something I had been looking forward to. I said I was excited about the big family dinner tomorrow, the annual summer reunion our mom hosted every year in the backyard. It had always been one of the few times when nearly everyone showed up at the same place. Aunts, uncles, cousins from different states, long tables under string lights, and way too much food spread across every surface. For a second, the kitchen went strangely quiet. Melissa didn't respond immediately. Her attention stayed fixed on her phone screen, and there was a subtle shift in the room that I couldn't quite identify yet. My cousin Danielle was sitting at the small breakfast bar nearby, finishing a drink, and the second my words registered with her, she froze. Then she started laughing. It wasn't a polite laugh or the kind of quick chuckle people give when they misunderstand something. It was the kind of laugh that escapes someone before they realize it might not be appropriate. She leaned forward slightly, still holding her phone in one hand, and looked directly at me with clear confusion. She said, "Wait, nobody told you." At first I assumed she meant something simple, like maybe the time had changed or the dinner had been moved to a different location. I told her I had it written down as tomorrow evening at our parents' place, same as every other year. Danielle shook her head while still smiling in that slightly awkward way people do when they realize they've stumbled into a strange situation. She said the dinner already happened. For a moment, I genuinely thought she was joking. The idea didn't make sense. That reunion had been scheduled the same weekend every year for as long as I could remember. I stood there holding a damp paper towel while the words settled in slowly. Danielle was still looking at me with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, and then she lifted her phone and began scrolling. She said it was last night. The screen turned toward me, and the first photo filled the display. It was unmistakably my parents' backyard. Long strings of warm lights hung between the trees, casting a soft glow across a set of large tables covered with food and drinks. People were standing in groups, holding glasses of champagne and smiling toward the camera. I recognized almost every face immediately. My parents stood near the center, surrounded by relatives who had clearly traveled in from out of state. Danielle swiped to the next picture. Another angle of the same gathering appeared, this time showing more of the backyard and even more familiar faces. My brother stood near the grill laughing with two cousins from Michigan. My aunt and uncle from Kentucky were seated at one of the tables. Even relatives I only saw once or twice a year were there. The celebration looked huge. The yard was full of people, the tables were decorated, and everything looked exactly like the kind of summer reunion our family had hosted for years. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I stood there in the kitchen while Danielle kept scrolling through the photos on her phone, and each new image felt like another quiet confirmation of something I had apparently been the only person in the room who didn't already understand. The backyard looked exactly the way it always did during our summer reunions, with long folding tables set up across the grass and strands of warm yellow lights hanging between the trees that my dad usually spent an hour carefully stringing up before sunset. In one picture, I could see the large cooler where my uncle always kept the drinks packed in ice, and in another I noticed the familiar blue tablecloth my mom reused every year. Everything about it was recognizable, down to the small details that made those gatherings feel consistent and predictable. But the strangest part was seeing how full the yard looked. Cousins who lived in other states were standing together near the fence, smiling and holding glasses while someone off camera must have been telling a joke. My aunt from Kentucky was sitting at one of the tables with a plate of food in front of her. My brother appeared in another photo with his arm around two relatives I hadn't seen in years. The entire scene looked lively and warm, the kind of gathering where people leaned toward each other while talking and laughed easily because everyone felt comfortable being there. Danielle kept swiping through the images like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and with every new photo, the same simple detail stayed painfully consistent. I wasn't in any of them. It wasn't the same strange situation as the other photos I'd seen over the years where I could tell myself I must have stepped away for a moment. These pictures showed the entire evening unfolding from start to finish. People arriving while the sun was still setting. Plates being filled with food. Groups posing together under the lights once it got dark. At one point, there was even a large group photo where nearly everyone had gathered together in the center of the yard. My parents stood in the middle of it, smiling widely. My siblings were there. My cousins were there. Even relatives who lived several states away had made the trip. And somehow the only person missing from the entire event was me. I felt my body go very still while Danielle continued scrolling, and the kitchen seemed unusually quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant thump of Ethan running around upstairs. For a few seconds, I couldn't even think of anything to say. My brain kept trying to find a reasonable explanation, the same way it always had before. Maybe the date had changed, and I somehow missed the message. Maybe someone assumed someone else had told me. Then I remembered something simple. There had never been a message. I had never been in the family group chat. While that realization slowly settled in, Melissa finally looked up from her phone. Until that moment, she had been leaning against the counter, quietly scrolling through something on her screen, almost like the conversation happening a few feet away didn't really involve her. When she raised her head, her expression didn't look surprised or embarrassed or even slightly uncomfortable. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from a long day of hosting a children's birthday party, but the kind of tired people get when they feel like they've had the same conversation too many times and would rather not have it again. Danielle was still holding her phone out toward me, halfway through showing another picture when Melissa spoke. Her voice was calm and flat, the way someone might state an obvious fact. She said maybe I should take the hint next time. The sentence landed in the room with a strange, kind of quiet weight. There was no anger in the way she said it, and no visible cruelty either. It wasn't delivered like an insult or an accusation. If anything, it sounded more like a simple conclusion she had reached a long time ago and was finally saying out loud because the situation had forced it into the open. For a moment, I just stood there holding the paper towel I had been using to wipe the counter. Danielle slowly lowered her phone. Nobody said anything else. The words kept replaying in my head in the same calm tone Melissa had used, and the meaning behind them became clearer with every passing second. All the small things I had brushed off over the years suddenly lined up in my memory with a new kind of clarity. The missing group chats, the inside jokes that never included me, the photos where I somehow always ended up just outside the frame. None of it had been random. None of it had been accidental. They hadn't forgotten me. They had simply stopped including me. I finished wiping the counter because the motion gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to process what had just been said. I gathered the last of the paper plates from the table and dropped them into the trash bag. The dishwasher was already running, humming quietly as it cleaned the remaining cups and utensils from the party. Melissa went back to looking at her phone. Danielle stayed silent at the breakfast bar. After a minute, I walked toward the small table near the living room where I had placed the birthday envelope earlier in the afternoon. It contained a little extra money I planned to give Ethan so he could buy additional parts for the robot once he learned how to program it. I picked the envelope up and held it for a second, realizing there was no reason to leave it behind anymore. Then I walked out the front door without saying anything else. The evening air outside felt cooler than I expected. The street was quiet, and most of the neighboring houses had their porch lights glowing softly against the dark. I crossed the driveway slowly and got into my car, closing the door with a soft click that seemed louder than usual in the silence. For a few minutes, I didn't start the engine. The car was parked under a streetlight near the curb, and the yellow glow spilled across the windshield while the rest of the street remained dim and still. I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the empty road in front of me. That was the moment when the realization finally settled in completely. For years, I had convinced myself that the distance growing between me and my family was just a series of misunderstandings. I believed people had simply forgotten things or overlooked small details. Every time something felt slightly off, I found a way to explain it away because the alternative felt too strange to accept. But sitting there in the quiet car under that streetlight, the pattern finally made sense. They hadn't been waiting for me to reconnect with them. They had been waiting for me to stop showing up. All those years of quiet exclusion weren't accidents or oversights. They had simply hoped that eventually I would understand the message and disappear on my own. I stayed in that parked car longer than I expected, watching the empty street under the yellow glow of the streetlight, while everything Melissa had said continued echoing quietly in my mind. The strange thing was that the longer I sat there, the calmer I started to feel. The first few minutes had been heavy and confusing, like my brain was still trying to rearrange years of memories into something that made sense, but eventually that confusion began to settle into something clearer. There was no dramatic moment where anger suddenly took over, and there wasn't any overwhelming urge to storm back inside the house and demand explanations. Instead, there was a quiet kind of understanding that slowly formed as the pieces finally fit together. For most of my life, I had believed that if I stayed patient and supportive, things would eventually correct themselves. Families go through difficult periods sometimes, and people drift apart without meaning to. I'd spent years assuming that if I continued showing up and doing the small things that held gatherings together, eventually someone would notice and remember that I belonged there too. Sitting in that car that night, though, I realized something simple that had somehow taken me decades to fully accept. You cannot convince people to value you by quietly proving that you are useful. That realization didn't feel dramatic or empowering the way it might sound when written down. It felt more like closing a book after finally reaching the last page. The story had already been written for a long time, and I had just been refusing to read the ending. So I made a decision while sitting there in the quiet. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to send angry messages or force uncomfortable conversations that nobody seemed interested in having. If my presence had slowly become something they preferred to avoid, then I would give them exactly what they had been hinting at all along. Distance. When I finally started the car and pulled away from the curb, the drive back to Columbus felt strangely peaceful. The highway was mostly empty that late in the evening, and the steady rhythm of passing streetlights gave me time to think about things I had never really allowed myself to examine honestly before. One of those things was the quiet role I had been playing in my family's life for years, a role that none of them even realized existed. My career had turned out better than I ever expected when I first started working in IT. I began as a junior technician doing basic support work, but over time I moved into consulting and specialized system security projects. Companies were willing to pay surprisingly well for someone who could quietly prevent expensive problems before they happened. I was careful with money, and I had always been the type of person who preferred stability over flashy spending. Instead of buying expensive cars or moving into a large house, I started investing early. The first property I bought was a small duplex on the edge of Columbus that needed more repairs than I probably understood at the time. I spent weekends learning how to fix things myself, slowly improving the place until it became a reliable rental. That one property eventually turned into 2, then 3, and over the years it grew into a small property management company that I ran alongside my consulting work. It wasn't some massive real estate empire, but it was stable and quietly profitable. At some point, after things were running smoothly, I created something else connected to the business. On paper, it looked like a small private foundation that occasionally provided grants to families dealing with unexpected financial situations. The paperwork was simple, the structure was legitimate, and because it operated under my business name instead of my personal identity, nobody ever connected the two. I never advertised it publicly. It existed mostly as a quiet way to help people when I knew they needed it. The first time I used it for someone in my family was when my parents needed major repairs done on their house. Their roof had started leaking after a heavy storm, and the damage was worse than they expected once a contractor inspected it. I remember my mom mentioning the situation during a phone call, explaining that they were trying to figure out how to pay for everything without dipping too far into their retirement savings. A few weeks later, they received a notice that a housing assistance grant had been approved through a regional property support program connected to a small foundation. They were relieved and surprised. They never knew that the paperwork approving that grant had been signed by me. After that, it became something I did quietly whenever the situation called for it. When my niece was born, a small college savings account appeared under a scholarship fund connected to the same foundation. When one of my uncles had a medical emergency that left him with bills his insurance didn't fully cover, an anonymous grant from a regional assistance program suddenly helped close the gap. Every time something like that happened, the reaction from my family was always the same: gratitude towards some distant organization they had never heard of before. They talked about how lucky they were that these programs existed. They mentioned how generous people must be to create funds that help strangers during difficult moments. Sometimes they would even bring it up during family gatherings, discussing how grateful they felt that someone out there cared enough to help when it mattered. I would sit there quietly listening while they talked about it. For me, it was never about recognition. I didn't need anyone to know where the help came from. The entire point was that they didn't have to worry about those problems anymore. If something small I had built could make their lives a little easier, that felt like enough. I had always believed that helping them in those ways was simply what family meant. Driving home that night, though, I realized something strange about the situation that had never fully occurred to me before. For years, I had been quietly supporting people who, at the same time, had been slowly removing me from their lives piece by piece without ever saying it directly. They had no idea that the anonymous support they appreciated so much had been coming from the same person they no longer seemed to want around. And the most honest part of the realization was that I had never done any of it expecting gratitude or recognition. I had done it because I believed I was helping my family. That night, for the first time, I understood that the word family might not have meant the same thing to all of us. The week after Ethan's birthday passed quietly, almost strangely calm compared to the weight of the realization that had settled over me that night in Dayton. I went back to my normal routine in Columbus, waking up early, checking on maintenance requests from tenants, answering emails from consulting clients, and reviewing reports connected to the properties I managed. From the outside, my life looked exactly the same as it had before. I still drove the same routes through the city, still stopped at the same coffee shop in the morning, and still spent long hours behind a computer solving technical problems for companies that preferred not to think about their systems unless something broke. The difference was internal. It was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time in years, I stopped reaching out to my family. I didn't send the casual messages I usually sent during the week, and I didn't check social media to see what gatherings or conversations I might have been missing. The group chat I had never been part of continued existing somewhere beyond my phone screen, and for the first time, I felt no urge to imagine what might be happening inside it. Instead, I focused on the things directly in front of me. Work felt simpler when it was the only thing occupying my attention. About 8 days after Ethan's party, the phone rang while I was reviewing invoices at my desk. The caller ID showed my mother's name. For a moment, I simply looked at the screen, noticing how unusual it felt to see it appear unexpectedly. My mother and I talked occasionally, but most of our conversations happened during gatherings or brief holiday calls. A random phone call in the middle of a weekday afternoon was rare. I answered. Her voice came through immediately, fast and anxious in a way I had heard only a handful of times in my life. She explained that the air conditioning system in their house had completely failed during one of the worst heat waves of the summer. Temperatures had been climbing steadily for days, and the inside of the house had apparently turned into something close to unbearable by mid-afternoon. A technician had inspected the unit earlier that morning and delivered the kind of estimate that makes homeowners go quiet. The system needed to be replaced. The total cost was around $11,000. She explained all of this quickly, almost breathlessly, and then her tone shifted slightly as she moved to the part of the conversation that she seemed to believe would solve the situation. She asked why the maintenance grant hadn't come through yet. At first, I didn't respond immediately because the question itself carried a strange kind of weight. I could picture her standing in the kitchen of that house, holding the phone while the broken air conditioner sat silent somewhere outside. In her mind, this situation probably felt like a temporary problem waiting for the usual solution to appear. For several years, that solution had always appeared. Whenever a major repair threatened to become financially overwhelming, some form of assistance connected to the small foundation had quietly covered the cost or reduced the burden enough that my parents could manage the rest without stress. From their perspective, it had become something almost predictable, a program that occasionally stepped in at exactly the right moment. My mother explained that she had already contacted the organization listed on the previous paperwork and had been told something confusing. The representative said the program no longer existed. There was a pause after she said that, the kind of pause where someone expects clarification. She asked if I knew anything about it. I leaned back slightly in my chair while holding the phone to my ear and looked out the window of my office. The afternoon sun was bright against the buildings across the street, and everything outside looked calm and ordinary. Then I told her the simplest version of the truth. I said the program had been shut down. There was a small moment of silence on the line, followed by immediate confusion in her voice as she asked why something like that would suddenly stop. From her perspective, it probably felt like losing a safety net that had always been there when things became difficult. I kept my voice calm while I answered. I told her that the program no longer existed because I had decided to close it. Another pause followed, longer this time. She asked why anyone would shut down something that helps so many people, and I could hear genuine frustration creeping into her voice now. The stress of the broken air conditioner mixing with the sudden disappearance of the financial assistance she had expected to rely on. For a few seconds, I considered explaining everything in detail, but the explanation itself would have required a conversation none of us had ever been willing to have honestly. So instead, I gave her a single sentence. I told her I was sure that everyone who attended the family dinner could figure something out. The words hung quietly between us. She didn't respond right away, and in that silence, I could almost hear the realization beginning to form on the other side of the line as she connected the comment to something she probably hadn't fully considered until that moment. Before the conversation could stretch into something more complicated, I told her I hoped they managed to stay cool during the heat wave and that I needed to return to work. Then I ended the call. After setting the phone down on my desk, I spent a few minutes staring at the paperwork in front of me before reaching for another contact in my phone. My lawyer had helped set up the structure for the foundation years earlier, so he understood exactly how it operated. When he answered, I explained that I wanted to terminate every remaining program connected to it. The maintenance grants, the educational accounts, the emergency medical assistance, all of it. He asked if I was sure. I confirmed that I was. The process itself was surprisingly straightforward because the programs had always been privately funded and discretionary. Within a few days, the paperwork began moving through the necessary channels. Accounts were closed. Automatic payments were stopped. Financial support that had quietly existed in the background of my family's lives for years simply ended. The effects didn't appear immediately, but within 2 weeks, the first consequences started to ripple outward. College accounts that relatives believed were steadily growing stopped receiving contributions. Assistance programs that had quietly handled certain expenses suddenly no longer existed. Repair funds, scholarship deposits, and emergency coverage that people had come to rely on quietly vanished from the places they had always appeared. For the first time in years, my phone began receiving messages from numbers connected to family members who rarely contacted me directly. At first, they were simple check-ins. Then they slowly turned into requests to talk. By the time the calls and messages started coming in regularly, I had already made peace with the fact that none of those conversations were really about me. They were about access. Access to help, access to convenience, access to the version of me that had always been useful without asking for anything in return. Once I understood that, it became much easier to see other things clearly too, especially the parts of family life that had always been treated as permanent traditions, even though in reality they were held together by paperwork, ownership, and quiet obligations that nobody ever bothered to think about because they assumed someone else would keep carrying them. The lake house was the clearest example. It sat outside Traverse City, Michigan, on a stretch of water that looked almost unreal at sunrise when the fog lifted slowly off the surface and the pine trees along the shore turned gold in the early light. Some of my earliest memories were tied to that place. Long weekends in the summer, damp towels hanging over the deck railing, cousins running through the grass barefoot, and adults sitting in lawn chairs with drinks in hand while they talked like the evening would never end. Every 4th of July, the whole family treated it like sacred ground. Cars would line the gravel driveway. Coolers would be dragged inside, and within an hour, everyone would settle into the familiar rhythm of occupying the place, as if it existed solely for their comfort and nostalgia. For years, that was how they spoke about it too, always calling it the family lake house, as if the phrase itself erased the legal reality underneath it. Nobody talked about taxes, overdue payments, insurance costs, maintenance, storm damage, or the years when the property came close to slipping away because certain bills had quietly gone unpaid. Nobody talked about the fact that sentimental places survive only when someone makes sure they do. A few years earlier, when my mother had fallen behind on payments connected to her share of the property, the situation had become serious enough that selling part of it was the easiest way to keep everything from unraveling. She had been embarrassed by the whole thing and didn't want most of the family to know how bad it had gotten. So, I handled it quietly. Through my business, and then later in my personal name, I bought out her share legally and cleanly. The paperwork was reviewed, filed, and recorded exactly the way it needed to be. No drama, no big family announcement, no moment where everyone gathered around a table to discuss what ownership actually meant from that point forward. They just kept using the house the same way they always had. I let that continue for a long time because at the time, I still believed preserving the tradition mattered more than being acknowledged for what I was doing. I paid attention to dock repairs, septic inspections, insurance renewals, and weather damage. When a section of the roof needed work after a bad winter, I handled it. When the deck boards on the back steps became unsafe, I paid to replace them. As far as most of my relatives were concerned, the house simply continued existing in usable condition because that was what the house had always done. After Dayton, though, I looked at that property differently. It was no longer possible for me to pretend that shared history automatically created shared respect. The family part of the lake house existed mostly in memory now, and memory alone was not a legal structure. Ownership was. Responsibility was. Boundaries were. So before 4th of July weekend, when everyone normally started arriving for the long holiday celebration, I drove up early. The house was quiet when I got there. Northern Michigan in early summer has a specific smell that always hits me the second I step out of the car, a mixture of pine, damp earth, and cool water moving against the shore. The driveway crunched under my tires the same way it had since I was a kid. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and was immediately met by the familiar stillness of the empty house before a gathering begins. The furniture sat exactly where it always had, the old wood interior still carrying that faint scent of lake air and age. For a minute, I just stood there in silence, looking around at the place everyone insisted on calling family. Then I got to work. A property attorney in Michigan had already helped me draft everything I needed. Because of the co-owner clause attached to the structure of the property, access and use could be formally restricted under certain conditions, especially once there was a dispute involving shared control, liability, and occupancy. I wasn't doing anything dramatic or illegal. I was just finally using rights I had possessed for years and never enforced. On the kitchen table, I placed a clean folder containing the proposed agreement. If they wanted continued access to the property going forward, they would need to sign formal terms covering scheduling, liability, upkeep, and use. No more casual assumptions. No more treating it like an unlimited free vacation spot that magically maintained itself. The second option was even simpler. We could sell the property and divide things according to the legal ownership structure already in place. By the time I heard the first car pulling into the driveway, the folder was waiting exactly where I wanted it. I stepped out onto the porch just as my sister Melissa's SUV came to a stop. Another car followed close behind, and when the doors opened, I saw Melissa, Danielle, and my mother stepping out into the afternoon light. For a brief second, they all looked mildly surprised to see me there so early. Then their attention shifted to the notice posted near the entry and the changed lock protocol connected to the co-owner restriction. Confusion hit first. Melissa asked what was going on in the sharp, impatient tone she used when something inconvenienced her. Danielle walked toward the porch faster, already visibly irritated, while my mother stayed near the driveway with that cautious, strained expression people get when they sense a conflict forming before they understand it completely. I told them simply that the property was now under formal restricted access until ownership terms were resolved. Danielle stared at me like I had started speaking another language. Then she demanded to know what that was supposed to mean. I explained that if they wanted continued use of the lake house, they would need to sign the agreement inside acknowledging the legal structure around access and responsibility. Otherwise, the alternative was to sell the property. That was when the mood changed completely. Danielle exploded first, her voice rising almost instantly into open anger. She started listing all the holidays, summers, and family traditions tied to that house, as if memory itself overruled recorded ownership. Melissa came up the steps next, her face tightening with disbelief before hardening into accusation. She called me selfish in the flat, contemptuous way people do when they realize someone they relied on has stopped being easy to use. My mother moved more slowly, but when she finally spoke, her voice carried that familiar note of guilt I had heard my entire life, the soft pressure of someone trying to make duty feel morally binding again. She talked about what the house meant to everyone, about how families work things out, about how this was not the way to handle something so important. I listened to all of it without interrupting. That was the strangest part for them, I think. They were used to the older version of me, the one who filled silence with explanations, who softened every disagreement before it could become too uncomfortable, who quietly adjusted himself so everyone else could remain at ease. Standing on that porch, I didn't do any of that. I let them say everything they needed to say. Then I told them the truth in the clearest sentence I had. I said they had destroyed the family part, and I was just handling the paperwork. Nobody answered right away. The words seemed to hit harder precisely because I said them calmly. I wasn't yelling, and I wasn't trying to wound anyone. I was stating the situation as it existed. They wanted the emotional language of family when it benefited them, but every time it came to including me, respecting me, or even acknowledging me, that same language had somehow disappeared. What remained now was the legal structure underneath all this sentiment, and that structure was finally being treated like what it had always been. Just paperwork. The lake moved quietly behind the house, small waves tapping against the dock while the three of them stood in front of me with anger, disbelief, and guilt passing across their faces in different combinations. On the kitchen table inside, the folder remained exactly where I had left it, waiting for a decision that for once could not be avoided with silence, exclusion, or hints. The morning after the confrontation at the lake house arrived quietly, the way mornings usually do near the water when the air is still cool and the light spreads slowly across the surface of the lake. I woke early out of habit and stepped outside onto the back deck with a cup of coffee, watching the thin layer of mist hovering just above the water while the sun slowly climbed behind the trees on the opposite shore. The entire place looked peaceful in a way that felt almost detached from the tension of the previous afternoon. If someone had arrived at that moment without knowing anything about the argument that had taken place on the porch, they would have assumed it was simply another calm summer morning at a quiet vacation house. Inside, the folder still sat on the kitchen table exactly where I had left it. No signatures had appeared overnight, and I had never expected them to. The reactions from Melissa, Danielle, and my mother the previous day had made it clear that none of them were interested in agreements or compromises. What they wanted was the same arrangement they had always relied on, the assumption that the house existed as a free space where family traditions mattered more than the actual structure that allowed the property to exist in the first place. But the moment on the porch had already settled something inside me. For years, I had treated the lake house the same way I treated everything else connected to my family. I protected it quietly, maintained it without recognition, and allowed everyone else to enjoy it while assuming that preserving those shared memories was worth whatever effort it required. That logic had made sense when I believed those memories belonged to all of us equally. Now I understood they did not. After finishing my coffee, I gathered the documents I had prepared the week before. The paperwork had already been reviewed carefully by my attorney, and the buyers had agreed to the terms after visiting the property earlier that month. They were a retired couple from Colorado who had spent years traveling through northern Michigan during the summers and wanted a quiet place near the water where they could finally settle into a slower pace of life. They liked the privacy of a location and the natural beauty of a lake, and they had approached the purchase with the kind of calm practicality that usually comes from people who have spent decades making thoughtful decisions. The agreement transferring my half of the property was straightforward. However, it included one specific condition that the couple had accepted without hesitation. A security gate would be installed along the boundary dividing the two ownership sections of the land, creating a clear physical separation between the properties so that no one could wander freely from one side to the other without permission. The wording in the contract described the purpose in neutral legal language related to privacy and property boundaries, but the intent behind it was simple enough. Uninvited guests would no longer be able to treat the entire space like a shared family playground. I drove into town later that morning and stopped at the small post office not far from the marina. The building looked exactly the way it probably had for decades, with a faded wooden counter and a quiet atmosphere that felt far removed from the noise of city life. I mailed the legal documents to the family attorney who had historically handled property matters connected to the lake house, along with the final paperwork required to complete the transfer once the closing date arrived. Along with those documents, I included a letter. It was not long, and it wasn't emotional in the dramatic sense people often expect from situations like this. I wrote it the same way I approached most things in my life, calmly and directly, because there was no reason left to pretend the situation was anything other than what it had become. In the letter, I explained that I had decided to sell my half of the property and that the transaction would move forward according to the legal agreements already filed. I clarified that the new owners intended to use their section as a private summer residence and that the installation of a security gate would be part of the property division once everything was finalized. Then I wrote the only personal part of the message. I explained that I had finally accepted the message my relatives had been sending for years, even if they had never said it openly. I wrote that I understood now that I had never truly been part of the family in the way I once believed. For a long time, I had tried to interpret their distance as misunderstandings or temporary conflicts, but the pattern had eventually become too clear to ignore. So I was respecting the boundary they had quietly created. The letter ended there. I didn't include accusations or complaints, and I didn't ask for explanations. By the time I placed the envelope on the counter at the post office, I felt no need to argue about anything that had already revealed itself through years of small decisions and quiet exclusions. The reactions began within a few days. At first, my phone started lighting up with calls from numbers I recognized immediately. Melissa called several times in a row one evening. Danielle left a message that started angry and ended somewhere between disbelief and frustration. My mother's voice appeared in a voicemail filled with confusion and disappointment, asking why I would do something that would change the future of a place that meant so much to everyone. As the days passed, the messages multiplied. Some of them were angry. Some tried to appeal to shared memories and traditions. A few sounded almost desperate, as if they believed enough persistence might convince me to undo something that had already been decided. I listened to none of them. The phone buzzed on the table occasionally while I worked, and sometimes the screen would light up with another missed call or another notification waiting to be opened. I let them sit there untouched. There was nothing left that needed to be explained. Every important conversation about our relationship had already happened over the course of years, not through direct words, but through the steady absence of inclusion. For the first time in my life, silence no longer felt like a sign that something was wrong. It felt like quiet. And quiet, I realized, could be peaceful in a way I had never experienced before. The months that followed the sale of the lake house passed in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to me at first, because for the first time in my adult life, there was a noticeable absence of tension sitting quietly in the background of everything I did. I had spent so many years adjusting my routines, my expectations, and even my emotions around the unpredictable dynamics of my family that I had never fully realized how much energy it consumed just trying to remain part of something that had slowly been pushing me out. Once that weight disappeared, the difference was immediate and surprisingly calm. Work became the center of my attention in a way it never had before. I had always taken my career seriously, but previously it existed alongside the constant habit of making time for family obligations, gatherings, and the quiet financial structures I had maintained for years behind the scenes. Without those responsibilities draining time and focus, my days suddenly became clearer and more productive. I started taking on larger projects within the company, overseeing system transitions that involve coordinating multiple teams across different cities. The complexity of the work suited me, and I found myself enjoying the challenge of solving problems that required long hours of careful planning. By early autumn, my performance reviews reflected the change. The leadership team had already been considering restructuring the department, and when the opportunity appeared, they offered me a promotion to Director of IT Operations. The position came with a larger team, greater responsibility, and the kind of authority that meant my decisions would directly shape the way entire systems functioned within the company. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time in years, my attention was fully invested in building something that belonged entirely to my own life. The promotion also meant travel. Some of it involved visiting company offices in other countries to oversee infrastructure upgrades, and those trips gradually opened a door I had never really allowed myself to explore before. For most of my adult life, I had quietly postponed the idea of traveling for pleasure. There was always some family event, some obligation, or some unspoken expectation that made it feel easier to stay nearby rather than disappear for weeks at a time. With those expectations gone, the decision became simple. That winter, I finally took a trip I had imagined for years but never planned seriously until then. I flew to Kyoto, Japan, alone, with no schedule beyond a few places I wanted to see and enough time to wander without feeling rushed. The city felt completely different from anything I was used to, quiet in certain corners and full of life in others, with narrow streets lined by wooden buildings and temples tucked between modern neighborhoods. I spent mornings walking through gardens where the air smelled faintly of cedar and moss, and evenings sitting in small restaurants where the conversations around me blended into a calm background rhythm of voices I didn't need to understand. Traveling alone in a place like that created a strange kind of clarity. Without the noise of familiar expectations, I began to see my life from a distance that had never existed before. The years I had spent trying to prove my value to people who had already decided I wasn't important enough to include no longer felt painful or confusing. They simply looked like a long period of misplaced effort that had finally come to an end. Back home in Ohio, the separation from my family remained exactly as I had left it. I heard occasional pieces of information through distant relatives or mutual acquaintances who mentioned things casually without realizing the history behind them. Melissa's online craft business had apparently struggled once the quiet financial safety nets around her began to disappear. A few other relatives who had grown used to anonymous assistance programs discovered that those resources had quietly stopped existing. Life, it seemed, had become more complicated for several people who had once assumed that solutions would always appear when they needed them. I didn't follow those developments closely. My days were full with work, travel planning, and the slow process of building a life that felt steady without relying on the approval or attention of people who had spent years pretending I wasn't there. Then one ordinary afternoon, several months later, something unexpected appeared on my desk. Part of my new role involved reviewing candidates for a paid mentorship program our company offered each year. The program brought in a small group of applicants who wanted experience working alongside senior IT staff, and my department handled the final selection process before the candidates were invited for interviews. Most of the applications were routine, the kind of documents you scan quickly for qualifications and experience before moving on to the next. I had already reviewed several that morning when I opened another file and paused. The name at the top of the application was Danielle. For a moment, I simply stared at it, almost amused by the coincidence. She had apparently applied to the program without realizing which department managed the final decisions. Her resume described her background in digital marketing and small business operations, including the craft business she had tried to build online. The tone of the application letter was professional and confident, the way people usually write when they believe they are introducing themselves to strangers. Reading it felt strangely detached. There was no anger left in me when I saw her name. The months that had passed since the confrontation at the lake house had created too much distance for those emotions to survive. Instead, there was simply a quiet awareness of the situation, the same kind of calm clarity I had experienced while walking through the temples in Kyoto. She had applied for an opportunity connected to my department, and I was the one responsible for deciding which candidates moved forward. The review process required that I either approve or decline the application before it advanced to the next stage. Danielle's qualifications were average compared to the rest of the applicants, and there was nothing in her submission that suggested she would stand out among the candidates we were considering that year. So I declined the application. Before finalizing the rejection notice, I opened the optional comment field attached to the response letter. The space allowed a short message to be included if the reviewer wanted to provide additional context or feedback to the applicant. For a moment, I considered leaving it blank. Then I typed 6 words. Maybe take the hint next time. I attached the note to the rejection letter and sent the response through the system, closing the file without thinking about it again. Outside my office window, the afternoon light was fading slowly across the buildings of downtown Columbus. My phone sat quietly on the desk beside me, and for the first time in years, there were no missed calls waiting to be returned. The silence around me felt steady and calm, and for the first time in my life, it felt exactly like the life I had chosen for myself.